So I haven't been making videos for the past 2 months. I was busy moving into this apartment here, and as I was moving here, I kept thinking, I like true crime story, I like murder story, but I also like history. Then I asked myself, why not put them both together? So that's how the idea came, the Yes to Murder. The whole point is simple. I tell you stories, murder stories from 100 years ago, and we are in the year 1898. Back when New York City took over the surrounding counties to create Manhattan, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. Time was different in those days. United States was in a 3-month war with Spain. Sitting at the top of the politics was William McKinley, the 25th president who brought gold standard to steer the American industry forward. He protected manufacturers from all sorts of competition from the outside world. He stood against free trade, saying it's better to buy where you can pay the easiest than buy where you can buy the cheapest, because the easiest pay is a spot where, in his words, labor wins its highest rewards. The reason why I'm talking about him, obviously he was shot to death, succeeded by good old Teddy. Now Roosevelt blasted his way to the top starting as a police commissioner in New York City. He changed everything in the NYC police. Physical exams, recruitment process that doesn't have anything to do with politics. The whole system in New York City that we know today, I think started from the system he built. Everyone hated him, and when everyone hated a leader, we know he was doing something right. In that system came Sergeant Arthur Carey and George McCluskey. Arthur was raised in an Irish neighborhood on the west side of Manhattan. His father was an immigrant from Ireland, a beautiful country ripped apart with troubles and turmoil because of the infamous Great Famine, causing over 2 million people to leave the country on packet ships and steamboats. Arthur's dear mom was a New Yorker, born and bred. She had to raise the children all by herself, setting course for Arthur toward law enforcement. In 1892, he became a detective, learning a lot from the Captain McCluskey, also an Irish-American popularly known as the Gentleman. I need you to understand something. Around this time, people were already talking about America. The groundwork that will later become the American dream was already there. Everyone thought life was better, richer, fuller here with more opportunities according to their capabilities. Because 50 years prior to Arthur Carey's time, Germans had fled their country after their failed revolution. And that's what made the whole United States a bit clawy. There were so many claws in the police themselves. McCluskey seemed to be a good cop, too good that he was demoted, kicked downstairs by his own chief. The police chief was alleged to have been involved in a gambling ring, gaining about $3 million from payoffs to corrupt police officials. So, despite this clawy system, Arthur and McCluskey were called to room 84 inside Grand Hotel at West 31st Street and Broadway to investigate a murder case. To give you a straightforward picture, imagine Nevada, Hollywood, Las Vegas all in one place. This was where people go for hookers, theaters, gambling, sometimes all at once, more or less like a religious experience you can't tell anybody about, especially their wives. So where people go, where thousands of people go, they need to sleep. They need to sleep, so there's a demand for hotels. One of those hotels, the Grand Hotel, fully staffed from top to ground. On the morning of August 16, 1898, a hotel maid headed straight to room 84. It was ordinary morning, so ordinary, nothing that she should be concerned about, maybe except for the yellow fever at Camp Wyckoff. But I doubt she knew about that anyway, because it wasn't even a major story that day. Things were always about the Spanish-American War. You pay 3 pennies for a newspaper, that's what, like $1 today, and all you get from the news is about the war. So this hotel maid just did her job, knocking on the door. She waited for the usual response, or perhaps the movements of people approaching to answer. But room 84 was quiet, so she knocked again. Quiet. She wondered, maybe the guest was asleep, so she did what every hotel maid would do. She made herself in slowly and carefully as not to catch a man without clothes. But inside, she found something a lot worse. It was a young woman, pretty little thing on the floor curled up with her head bashed with a lead pipe. Sergeant Arthur Carey and Captain McCluskey came for this murdered woman. By the time they arrived, the place was already sealed off for an active investigation. They managed to wiggle out some information from the hotel ledger. Room 84 had been rented to Mr. and Mrs. E. Maxwell, whoever the hell they were. The officials carried Mrs. Maxwell's body onto a table, somewhat marveled at her striking beauty. She really had a face, unscathed, except for the impact at the back of her head. The blow was said to be so powerful that it cleaved through her spine, suffocating her. One of her earlobes was torn, perhaps when her earring popped off. Other than that, the room was clean, and they took note of the empty champagne bottle and 2 glasses on another table. Mrs. Maxwell had seen somebody that night. The coroner removed part of her clothes, I believe it was a blouse. And as he was undoing the blouse, money came spilling out. It was $8.67. It should be at least $300 today. This much money wouldn't come as a shocker for anyone. But what came out next after the $8 changed the whole game. Inside her blouse there was a check from Garfield National Bank, and that check was signed for $25,000, payable to a woman named Emeline C. Reynolds. Arthur and McCluskey saw right there the check had been endorsed by 2 men, Dudley Gideon and S.J. Kennedy. They were left wondering, why did Mrs. Maxwell have a $25,000 worth of check for Emeline Reynolds? That's a lot of money. It should be at least $1 million today. The second question, who on earth is S.J. Kennedy? Arthur heard about Gideon before. He was a bookmaker named, he was sure to be Dave Gideon, not Dudley. The detective broke off to question around the hotel and the bank. The hotel staff had a story that prompted an interesting theory. First, the elevator man claimed to have seen Mrs. Maxwell in the company of a man wearing a straw hat. This man was not Mr. Maxwell. He was later seen with Mrs. Maxwell when a waiter served lunch. Mrs. Maxwell paid him $10. He returned $8.67. So now the police knew where the money came from. This man was also seen by a bellhop who delivered a bottle of champagne. And he was last seen by a night clerk putting on his straw hat as he left the hotel at 2:30 in the morning. Whoever murdered Mrs. Maxwell must be this man. He was the only one last seen with her. And the theory sprouted further when word came from the bank. There were no records about Emeline Reynolds and Dudley Gideon, but S.J. Kennedy was a match. The bank had Samuel J. Kennedy as a depositor. He was a small-time dentist at West 22nd Street, and McCluskey deployed his detective to question Kennedy about the murder. They learned Kennedy was married, and he was living on Staten Island. Of course, he denied ever knowing the woman in room 84, Mrs. Maxwell. His mouth said one thing. However, his record said another. As investigators peered deeper into Kennedy, they found one particular interesting name in Kennedy's list. Emeline C. Reynolds, the woman who was supposed to receive the big buck check. Miss Reynolds apparently had a dental treatment sometime back. There was an abscess in her tooth, or maybe her gum, and as it turned out, the coroner found traces of the same treatment on the woman in room 84. So that solved one thing. The body was not Mrs. Maxwell. It was Miss Reynolds, also known as Dolly. She was 22 years old when she died, coming from Mount Vernon, a city about 20 miles to the north. 4 years before, people in Mount Vernon held a vote to join the city of Greater New York, but the referendum were unfavorable that Mount Vernon remain independent to this day. It really was a quiet city, peaceful compared to the bustling of Manhattan. Emeline lived in Mount Vernon with her wealthy family, but there was something missing about her. She had the look that could turn every head in the room. She had the smile that could brighten your life, and she knew how to talk her way through things, according to her mother. But she cannot stay in Mount Vernon because her heart had always been in the creative arts. She wanted to be an actress. Now, when it came to acting, your mind should go to theaters, not movies. Movies, motion pictures at the time were just starting out. Even then, it wasn't really a thing. They had mountains to move. I mean, the people wasn't really ready for it. Today, we go to the movies, we see Captain America lifting Thor's hammer, and we scream out of joy because we knew it. It was safe. It was just a movie. But 130 years ago, the people went to see movies. They saw a locomotive battling toward the screen, battling toward the camera at high speed, and they screamed out in fear because they thought the locomotives would burst into them. It really wasn't a thing. Or so the legend said. Not every movie was a motion picture. Some looked like this. It appeared that Emeline came to New York City for her dreams. She purportedly had a knack selling books to buy her way into the city, but we know what that means. Sergeant Arthur Carey agreed on the selling, but not the books. She met Samuel J. Kennedy for dental work. This is where Emeline's father came in. He told Arthur about a money-making scheme Emeline had hatched. They were going to put on electrified saddles on racehorses to make it run faster. Her father saw the trick through the bones, but Emeline caught it by the hook, line, and sinker. She took out $500 from the bank for Dr. Kennedy under the condition that her share of the winnings should be the magic number found on the check, $25,000. That was the nail Arthur needed to put Kennedy on the cross. Once Kennedy admitted that he had treated Emeline, that's it. Arthur took him under custody. During a strip search, he found Kennedy's underwear to have a distinct black smudge. But we'll come to that later because there was a wrinkle in this investigation. Investigators found more information about Emeline's finances. She had a lavish lifestyle in an apartment on West 58th Street. Again, perspectives are needed in case you're not from New York City like me. West 58 lines up a road so close to Central Park. That time, it was on a decline because of high maintenance costs and budget cuts. In the 1890s, Central Park was a center for amusement and drink stand. It's not like what it is today. And Emeline had an apartment in this expensive part of the city paid willingly by a man named Maurice Manham. He was a stockbroker, also a married man, obviously. He even bought her jewelry and they had been living like a husband and wife despite he was married. So now investigators came to a circle asking themselves, we got Manham, we got Kennedy, now who's the man in the straw hat? Kennedy said he had no straw hat, but again, his record said otherwise. He had gone to a haberdasher the day before the murder, and his haberdasher acknowledged Kennedy had bought a hat. It was a straw hat. Police brought the hotel staff into investigation. They were asked to choose the man with a straw hat from a lineup, and all of them pointed to Samuel J. Kennedy as the man they had seen accompanying Emeline the day before she was murdered. It explained why Kennedy had a smudge upon the same underwear he had been wearing. That's the mark from a lead pipe when cleaned with a piece of cloth. Whether he wiped the lead with his underwear, I don't want to know. Don't even ask me to go there. Further search in his home uncovered an iron rod which police believed was used to support the lead pipe. There was no denying this was the murder weapon. The police believed that Kennedy was a con man. Just as Emeline's father had said, there was no electrified saddle. It was just a trick to lure Emeline into his game. The con was not the racehorse. The con was not the $25,000. The con was the $500 Emeline had given to Kennedy. He returned a check signed by someone named Gideon, who did not exist, meaning the check was fake. Emeline was not getting her money. What more, her promised profit that would God Almighty allowed her to live on her own, that she wouldn't need Maurice Manham anymore. Maybe Emeline found out the check was fake, so Kennedy had one choice. He took her out. The court agreed, and Kennedy was sentenced to the chair the next year. Before you celebrate, you should know he won an appeal because the evidence had not been presented in the right way. He got away on technicality. Mood had dipped for the worst before the second trial, when people started believing Kennedy had been made a scapegoat. I told you, people don't believe in cops in those days. There's just way too many corrupts. Kennedy was not convicted in the second trial, nor he was convicted in the third, because the jury was hung, yet inclined toward not guilty. It was at the time everyone realized Emeline Reynolds would not be given justice. Her perpetrator, if indeed was Kennedy, walked scotch-free into the regaling cheer of supporters who threw him a big party. There was nothing they can do at that point, even to Maurice Manham, who had an alibi. Some sources claimed the check was $13,000, but that's not important, is it? Neither was Emeline Reynolds, who slipped deeper and deeper into the tomb of time. Chances are you never even heard of her. There's not even a picture of her. We don't even know how she looked like, and that's why I decided to tell you her story. We may not be able to do justice now, but at least we can keep her alive. Now I got more stories to tell you, more and more stories about people like Emeline. For Emeline alone, I think I've read about 100 pages of newspapers just to keep her stories alive. I hope you like this one, and if you do like it, I'll see you in the next video.